Blinded by the light. Can you see what time it is? So I've been up since 3 a.m. and I am here trying to decide, should I talk about light, heat, or power? And what occurs to me is they're all three connected. You can't really separate them, so there's going to be some overlap, but this video is going to be specifically about heat. Can you see my wood stove here? And because it's really cold right now, because I have no heat running and it's 20-something degrees outside, I'm fully dressed. So deep breath. This is, okay. So deep breath. My name is Jill. This is my first off-grid winter in the mountains, telling you what I've learned. And today we're talking heat, or really the lack of. We defy all the world. And cheer, cheer the Green Mountaineer. And cheer, cheer. Turning my soul to scream out. Okay, we're back, and let's just dive in and talk about the discussion of heat. When I started this and planned on this a couple years ago, my goal with this horse trailer was to put in a wood stove as my primary heat source, because my goal was, if we're in a grid down situation, I could always get wood. All the other heat sources require some kind of grid up capacity to produce propane, fuel, electricity, transportation. So living close to a wood source was also important. I'm not sure how that one's going to work out. So wood was my primary heat source. Previous to this, I've been in a little tiny trailer for the last almost 10 years using exclusively electricity to heat. I think I have 5 electric heaters now. And then what happened is I defaulted into a propane heater. This is a Campy propane heater. I'm going to tell you why I love it almost as much as my wood stove. It has a little cook on the top. I know it's dangerous, but we're going to talk about that too. So this is the point in the video. If you are really wanting this information for yourself, I would pause, get something to write with, because I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to tell you how to consider to make choices in what works best for you. Pause here. So before we talk about how to alter our environment so that we don't feel cold, I'm going to bring up 2 things that I don't really hear people talk about very much, but are super important in a return to more of an undomesticated lifestyle. So remember, these videos aren't just about off-grid. They aren't about grid up or grid down. They're also about how to return to more of a natural state of human design, our blueprint, not just unplugged domestication. Because I personally believe domestication is the cause of most of what we call disease, disorder, disability, that kind of thing. So what you see me wearing in all its loudness is several layers. So this is my super long scarf that can double in summer or winter, a hoodie, flannel, wool undershirt, and then this thing, I've talked about it before, is basically a windbreaker, but it does a really good job of keeping the heat in. And also, just as a side note, 30% of the heat goes off your head, so when you're sleeping and it's super cold, you might want a little hat. This is the first year I've started to do that. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So, slowing down. So one of the things that I learned when I was using electric heat as my primary source is I was in a constant state of fear that the electricity would go out. Now, for some reason, in almost 10 years, I never had the electricity go out for more than a few hours. That was a miracle, because I was in a pretty precarious situation with, dangling wires, high wind, and crazy weather. So to me, that was kind of a miracle thing. But what I've learned since now I've used alternative heat is that electricity is the #1 heat source for being able to go to sleep, relax, not worry about asphyxiation, overheating, or setting yourself on fire, with the rare exception that your wires might go out. However, it's expensive. It is dependent on the grid. It's not really practical for the use of a generator or a solar powered or a 12-volt system. It could be done if you were super invested in all the right stuff, but it's much easier just to plug in. Now, the flip side of that is it's super easy to just plug in, and you don't have to think about it, and you can alternate the level of heat and then forget about it. You can go to sleep, you can walk away, you can leave the house. It's very comforting to know it's an extremely stable, consistent, low maintenance form of heat. I totally miss it. The other thing that it does that does not is if you put it on the ground, it heats from the bottom up. So there isn't this issue with the stove, which we'll get to in a little bit. So electric is the best for all around practical, with a few exceptions. So because of that fear that I had about the power going out and I was going to be sitting around in 0-degree weather, I made the decision that in this horse trailer, I wanted a wood stove because that felt like me taking my power back. I could take control of the reins, and I could forage for wood, and I could chop it, and I could run the fire, and it would be awesome. And I'll be honest, wood heat is my favorite kind of heat. It's still my favorite kind of heat, but as I'll go over in a lot more detail in just the wood stove video, the bottom line is super high maintenance. These little tiny stoves don't run, I would say, 2 hours max before they're totally cold from blazing inferno, which makes sleeping almost impossible. You do have to have a venting source so you don't use up all your oxygen, and so that's bringing cold air in if it's windy or it's super, super cold. The pipe here, the creosote slash whatever builds up so fast because I'm using dirty wood. Every 3 fires or so, I have to go up on the roof and clean out the stack. The heat, while awesome, is very difficult to regulate. And the biggest issue was, besides sleep, is the bottom half of the trailer was so cold, even fans pushing the heat down weren't enough. And as time was going by, it was getting increasingly colder to where I couldn't recover, and so things on the bottom were starting to freeze. And so that was a big negative, in addition to my arriving in the mountains late, not having a proper wood supply. All I had access to was pine and the juniper, which is a decent hardwood, but I only had the dirty stuff that's been laying on the ground that burned filthy, which caused the buildup in here, and tons of ash. But I still love wood heat. The other thing I'm going to say about wood heat is if you decide to take a wood stove with you, while it is awesome, there is a total learning curve, and this one requires so much more oxygen than the way it's physically designed to set up. So it took some experimenting to not set everything on fire by how far the door I needed to keep open, how to operate the damper, how to get it started and keep it started. But for the majority of the time, it is a high maintenance heat source, because if you turned your back for more than like 20 or 30 minutes, all of a sudden it would go out, or it would get too hot, and then you would have to fiddle with it. So a lot of work, a lot of maintenance, a lot of risk, but it's awesome. So I'm really, really happy I have it. But it would be a terrible choice if you were traveling on a regular basis, just trying to get it cooled down enough to travel. It's kind of unstable. I have to actually dismantle this and put it on the ground to travel. So that was why I chose the wood stove and why I moved over to propane. Since electricity wasn't an option, I'll be honest, when I had electrical hookup, the electric heater on the floor and the wood stove were perfect, way better than the propane. But because I have no electricity, I decided to try propane. Now, Mr. Buddy is the one that everybody gets. It's probably a lot safer. They have a really cool new system called, I think, Trex, where you have a 180-degree heater, and then you have an attachable burner. But that whole system is like $200. This system, and why I like it, is that it's a 360-degree heat Most of the heat comes out of the top, so I keep it on the floor for a good chunk of the time so it heats up the bottom. Not hot, but enough to stop everything from freezing. And then on top, I don't know if you can see that, there's a burner. So you open and you can close that. If you open it up, you can do a burner and cook and boil water, which is way freaking faster. Whoops. Than the 45 minutes to an hour waiting for my water to boil on the wood stove. It's portable. I'm right now in winter time. If I go with the wood stove, I'll use this to heat up in the morning, and then I'll after the wood stove gets started, I'll turn this off. And I was going on a 5-gallon tank, so that's 4.5 pounds of propane. I still wasn't even using it up in 2 weeks, which was like $12. So it was really only running me, you know, $5 or $6 a week, the way I use this. So, but the problem with this heat source is, and it's getting really rusty, which is probably bad. The problem with this is it too will eat up all your oxygen, so you do need to vent it. And so my concern with running it for long periods of time or setting everything on fire, I'm sure you've seen those propane videos where the trailers are on fire and are completely demolished because people have used inside propane heaters, is I don't sleep with this thing on. I turn it off before I go to sleep, and then I wake up to sub-zero temperatures and get up and turn the heater on. It heats it up within 30 to 40 minutes. It's at least 60 degrees in here. So the discomfort is pretty minimal, but I do not run it overnight. So I don't really have any overnight heating sources because I don't want to die in my sleep, and I certainly don't want the dog to. So that takes me to why I'm up at 3 a.m. for a couple reasons. The first one being the only time my internet connection works through my phone is from 3 to 5 a.m. After that, as soon as the sun gets anywhere near the horizon, the connection is shot. So if I want to upload a video, I have to get up early. But this is what I also learned. If you look at temperature dips around 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. is the coldest portion of your day. If you're just averaging 30 degrees at night, it's not going to start getting cold until 5 or 6 a.m. inside. And so what I started doing was just going to bed like at 7:30, getting up between 2 and 3 to turn the heat on. It worked out better for me if I stayed awake than if I went back to sleep, because then it felt like my whole day was shot. So, but that I found was a pretty good situation, in addition to having lots and lots of covers, wearing lots of clothes, and then I get up every time. So this is how it goes. We cover Freedom up. We cover Freedom up. Freedom takes the covers off when he moves. We cover Freedom up until he takes the covers off when he moves. Do you like being all cuddly in the covers, Freedom? Yes. Or I wake up every time the dog shifts and moves, so I can keep the blanket on him, because it literally gets into the 20s or teens inside of here. It is cold. I have cried a few times. It is uncomfortable. But since I've had the propane heater, I'm not like crying while I try to get the fire going. It just starts right away. I can control it. I can go by it. It's within my power and my grasp, much more than the wood stove, to keep a consistent form of heat in the trailer. And the other thing that it does is it's a little easier to regulate than the wood stove. The wood stove is extremely difficult. It's either too hot or too cold. It's hard to find, in a little space, it's hard to find that middle ground. The propane heater, it only has, this one runs between 9 and 13,000 BTUs, so it's pretty warm, and so I just turn it off. I let the heat drop and then I turn it back on, but much less energy and attention to that than there is to the wood stove. Now, the other thing that I've learned is, because this is a small space, so this is a little over 3 feet, we keep it really warm with no heat. So if it's 30 degrees, 25 to 30 degrees outside, it's still 40 degrees when I wake up in here. The only time it dips is when it starts to get into the low teens, single digits, 0 or below, or if there's a lot of wind. Because even though I have it as sealed as good as I can, the wind still gets in. So I think part of that is because there's two bodies respirating up here, so we are blowing hot air, maybe more than others, me and the dog, and so I think that keeps it slightly warmer. And so that works out pretty good. So that's a positive. The negative is that that overheats way faster than over here. Now, the whole part about heat and going wild, what I learned as a social worker and just observation is most people try to regulate heat by external methods. What can I do to make my living space warm so I don't have to change any of my behavior? In nature, we have to wear more clothes or less clothes. We have to have more skin exposed or less skin exposed. And there's so many health benefits to being cold. It's crazy. For those of you who watch Wim Hof, he talks about that all the time. But there's a lot of really positive benefits to being cold. And I sleep better when it's cold than I do when it's too hot. I feel better. I'm less foggy. I'm less confused. I'm less irritable when I have a colder air temperature than a hotter air temperature. But I feel safer and more secure knowing I can warm things up if I need to. So what I've really learned in this process is that, one, I'm not going to die because I now have multiple heat sources. So I can relax a little bit, because worst case scenario is I can go outside, cut some wood, come in and get enough of a fire going. It's been up to 100 degrees up there, so I can be warm in any situation. That makes me feel really good. It might be very labor intensive, but I can. The physical labor of chopping wood is good for me. It's good for my body. It's got me outside. There's so many positive benefits to using wood as your heat source. I would never tell you to dismiss it other than the costs of the stove. I wouldn't spend $1,000 on a tiny stove. But unless you're rich, and that's no big deal. So as it's gotten warmer out though, 30 at night, I don't use this because it's just not that cold, and the propane heats it up really fast. And now that the sun is up, the sun comes in the south windows. I forgot to mention that. So if you're in a trailer, the really important pieces of staying warm are making sure that you've got most your big windows facing south, getting as much sun as possible, because it really doesn't matter how cold it is outside. If I can pull in that south sun, I'm warm all day. The only time I run heat during the day is when it's a big, dark, cloudy, snowy, and the temperature never gets above freezing. Those are the only days I ever run heat during the day. Or I'm feeling sorry for myself and I need to be extra warm. That happens too. So, and I drink extra coffee, cocoa, and tea. I do that also. So this ran kind of long, but there's so much to think about. Where are you? How far away is your primary heat source? What do you have access to? What are your backups? One of the comments might be, well, you can use a generator. Well, the problem with a generator is it requires gas. You can't keep it outside if it's going to get wet. It can be difficult to start if it gets too cold. There's a lot of issues, and it's loud. So there's a lot of issues with just using generator for electricity. So I really recommend having both a grid up and grid down heat source. But again, my perfect combination is electric and wood with backup of propane. That's my heat heaven point. So that's just something to think about. Like I said, there's cost, there's access. Can you walk and get heat? Can you physically manage chopping wood, splitting wood, carrying wood? One of the decisions I made was to not get a chainsaw because it hurts my hands too much, so that's why I just got a saw. And I ended up not needing extra wood from what I bought at the very beginning of all this. But next year, I'll try and cut a deal where I can get the big pieces cut for me, and then I can split them up for myself. So it's really finding what you're physically capable of doing, what you have the time for. Wood is very labor intensive. Propane requires you to keep an eye on it. The tanks are heavy and you have to go buy it from somewhere unless you have a big tank. And you can have it delivered, but there has to be electricity for that. Or electric is the easiest and cheapest. Easiest, you just plug it in, you don't have to think about it. So those are my conversations on heat, how we were meant to be outside, heating around a fire and experiencing cold. And I just heard something very interesting about Native Americans and cold. And one of the reasons the creators had cold was to figure out who was strong, and the strong would survive through the winter. And the winter was the time when people would die because they didn't have the strength to survive. And civilization, you know, made all these adjustments so that anybody can live through winter. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we have to look at that carefully. You know, we're controlling our environment, so we're turning off our natural physical body's reaction to cold. The immune boosting benefits, the strengthening benefits, all the things that happen in winter that are required to keep us as a healthy, whole human. Just something to think about. So I'm not saying you should go live outside naked and run around in the cold at night, but I am saying a little bit of cold's not a bad thing. Learning to dress more appropriately than trying to control the environment all the time. And one more thing, if you move, you'll warm up. I think nature knew what it was doing. So that's it for this series. Once they are done, you'll find the playlist below. We're going to take a deep breath, and I have talked a lot, but we'll still see you next time. Ugh, I'm stuck.